All right, hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to be looking at chapter 7 in this video. In my book, the Signet Classic Edition, we're on page 69. Now, this chapter has a lot of heft to it, so I'm going to do my best to keep this short and sweet. You know, I'm not good at that, so my apologies, but here we go. So, Winston begins here, and one of the formal elements I want to point out to you is this use of italics. Whenever there is this use of italics, as there is at the beginning of the chapter here, so far it's indicating writing. It could also be indicating thought at some point, so keep an eye out for that. But every time it's been used so far, I believe it's in the context of this is what Winston is writing in his journal. So Winston writes in his journal, if there was hope, it lies in the proles. So that's one of the big ideas we're going to be looking at in this section, the role of the proles, and answering that question, why would the proles contain the hope for the future? Now, something struck me right off the bat here. Winston notes that the proles are 85% of the population. And I was like, whoa, hold on a second. I thought from reading this, up until now, it seems like the whole society is the party, right? It's within this big brother structure. But Winston comes out and he shatters that idea that I had by saying 85% of the population is living outside of that system. So right off the bat, things have changed in my mind, how I see the society in 1984 of Oceania, making more parallels to what probably Orwell was specifically commenting on would be, his world around the turn of the century, around the industrialization of London. And so what I'm beginning to think is that the 85% of the population is basically representing working and lower class people. We kind of have an idea like this in our society post, you guys were younger, but post sort of the Occupy Wall Street movement, they kind of popularized this idea of a 1%. Now, the 1% number, while it's not necessarily accurate, it's a good meme that's easily passed down and people understand where there is this idea of an elite class. And I think this 85% number, it's a huge number. It's very, very similar to the kind of 1%, 99% parallels that Occupy was trying to draw. Now, remember, Orwell being a socialist, he is very concerned with the well-being and the welfare of that lower or underclass, of that 85%. So let's keep an eye out for the significance of the proles, as Winston has declared, if there is hope, it lies with them. So now the significance of the proles in the story has taken new heights. I've commented several times about poverty in London, poverty in Soviet Russia. This just kind of, again, is connecting me back to that Soviet system where criminals were given lower sentences than political prisoners under Article 58. Criminals were largely ignored because crime would indicate a flaw in society, right? Many of their crimes resulted from extreme poverty, like theft, like prostitution, but the party wanted nothing to do with them. They were largely ignored. And the people who the party were concerned with were the political thought criminals. And those were people who would receive, 25-year sentences. Whereas, if you were a murderer or a thief, you could get a very low sentence, like 5 years. And that's just one parallel I'm drawing here with the mention of the proles. In Orwell's description, or Winston's description of the proles, he's giving them this sort of characteristic of strength, but a working class strength, like a primal or almost a brute-ish strength, not necessarily an intelligent one. It's an old world bodily intelligence, a physical intelligence. And he uses a sort of metaphor of a horse, comparing the proles to a horse. And this, of course, reminds me of Animal Farm. Animal Farm was written only 4 years before this book. If you have not read Animal Farm, again, like Brave New World, that is certainly a book you should read. It's only 100 pages long, and I will definitely be doing some videos on that. I taught Animal Farm in 10th grade, and I got a really good reaction from my students to that book. So please check it out if you haven't. But there's a character in Animal Farm, which is an allegory named Boxer. And I believe if anything, Orwell is just reusing a metaphor here, but he might be making a direct allusion to Boxer in his own work. Remember, allusion with an Allusion, is a reference to another text, and I believe that's what's happening here. A horse is a very strong, capable, working animal, but in Animal Farm, Boxer he's not an intellectual. He's not part of the intelligentsia. He is just strong. But that strength, he puts the farm on his back, to use a phrase that you might have heard before. But literally, Boxer is the foundation of strength for the working class. Orwell comments how their anger, which the proles' anger, is misdirected at fights with each other in the street over saucepans, rather than directing their anger at the place where it should be directed, which is this elite class of party members whose only role is to keep them subservient to them, to keep this 85% in their place outside of political power. And I think that's something that we can reflect on and kind of draw parallels to other societies, possibly even including our own. I'm curious to what you all think about that section where Orwell notices the proles. He thinks he hears a revolution going, like, oh, they finally started to riot, but really they're just fighting over a saucepan. And he wishes that they had used some of that anger against Big Brother rather than at each other. Because again, they make up 85% of the population. They're a vast majority, and they have the strength to overthrow Big Brother if they were able to somehow coalesce and come together with a vision or a united plan. So I'm going to give a rather long quote now. This is on page 70 in my book. I believe there's a lot of commentary here on the Russian Revolution to overthrow the Tsarist regime. If you're not familiar with that, I will come out with some videos and post the link to that in the description. Also, Animal Farm was sort of a direct allegory of that historical event. But let's just look at the quote for the quote's sake first. Okay, so this is at the bottom of page 70 on my book, right after Winston writes in his journal, until they become conscious, they will never rebel. And until after they have rebelled, they cannot become conscious. The quote continues, that, he reflected, might almost have been a transcription from one of the party textbooks. The party claimed, of course, to have liberated the proles from bondage. Before the revolution, they had been hideously oppressed by the capitalists. They had been starved and flogged. Women had been forced to work in the coal mines. Women still did work in the coal mines, as a matter of fact. Children had been sold into the factories at the age of 6. So this goes back to what I've talked about in previous chapters about these critiques of industrialization and capitalism, something that Marx was critiquing, and I think there are valid critiques to be had here. We don't want women working in coal mines unless they want to work there, and we don't want children at the age of 6 working in factories. Certainly, we can all agree on that, and we have agreed on that. Continuing on, but simultaneously, true to the principles of doublethink, the party taught that the proles were natural inferiors who must be kept in subjection, like animals, by the application of a few simple rules. In reality, very little was known about the proles. It was not necessary to know much, so long as they continued to work and breed. Their other activities were without importance. Left themselves, like cattle turned loose upon the plains of Argentina, they had reverted to a style of life that appeared to be natural to them, a sort of ancestral pattern. And so here, this is multiple comparisons being drawn between the proles and animals. And there is a certain condescension that's occurring between the party class, the revolutionary class, and what they consider to just sort of be not slaves, but like cattle, how they're just bodies for the system to work, right? They're just manpower, but they are not humanized in any way. They are natural inferiors. And what we see here is a subjugation of natural human instincts. That natural or primal or animalistic human instincts are inferior, and that these people deserve to be subjugated against. Let's continue on. They were born, they grew up in the gutters, they went to work at 12, they passed through a brief blossoming period of beauty and sexual desire, they married at 20, they were middle-aged at 30, they died, for the most part, at 60. Heavy physical work, the care of home and children, petty quarrels with neighbors, films, football, beer, and above all, gambling, filled up the horizon of their minds. So that whole section right there, remember that we are in the land of satire, right? Satire, we're poking fun at institutions, we're poking fun at things, making jokes of them while raising serious points. And so here, what you might notice is that this is just human stuff, right? This is, if you were to go back to 1949, that whole section that I just read is describing the vast majority of middle and working class people, right? They grow up, they work, they get married, they work hard, they drink beer and watch football, they get in little, quarrels, they gamble, and that's life. And so what you see here is that this, now in the future, what was considered to be kind of a middle or lower class lifestyle in the 40s is now being looked upon as prole behavior, as inferior, as a way to indicate that you deserve to be subjugated, you deserve to be in the underclass, right? This is animal behavior. And so that should be kind of ironic or silly or funny to us, because Orwell's saying like, oh, the way we act now is animal behavior compared to the way that, this utopia wants us to act in this more artificial, technological way, similar to what we talked about last chapter with sex, a kind of numbing of human instinct. Just a bit more of this quote. To keep them in control was not difficult. A few agents of the thought police moved always among them, spreading false rumors and marking down and eliminating the few individuals who were judged capable of becoming dangerous. But no attempt was made to indoctrinate them with the ideology of the party. It was not desirable that the proles should have strong political feelings. All that was required of them was a primitive patriotism, which could be appealed to whenever it was necessary to make them accept longer working hours or shorter rations. And even when they became discontented, as they sometimes did, their discontent led nowhere, because being without general ideas, they could only focus on petty, specific grievances. The larger evils invariably escaped their notice. So those last few sentences are something that I think are very important, going back to what we talked about just a bit earlier with the fighting over the saucepans in the street. I want to know what you guys think about the significance of those statements are. The idea that because the proles are without general ideas, they can only focus on specific petty grievances, and that the larger evils invariably escape their notice. All right. The quote does continue on, talking about, criminality in London. But the one other thing I want to draw your attention to is at the end of that paragraph, at the top of page 72, the proles were beneath suspicion. As the party slogan put it, proles and animals are free. And so that I'm not going to comment on. I want to know what you all think about the comparison there. Proles and animals are free. The only thing I will say is just to draw our attention back to how I'm making connections here. I'm connecting this back with Animal Farm. Obviously, Orwell was the author of Animal Farm, so there's going to be some idea overlap. But there are these slogans that occur in Animal Farm that are being written as sort of the farm slogans, and this is very reminiscent of those slogans. So if you're interested in that, just check out my Animal Farm videos. All right, well, there's obviously some commentary on the Russian Revolution and the idea that the communists overthrew the czarists because of the way that the czars were sort of hoarding money and, completely did not care about, the actual people, the lower classes that were dying of starvation in the streets while Tsar Nicholas was feasting in his castle. But the irony is that the revolution overthrew the czarist regime only to install a communist one that practiced many of the same things, and nothing much really changed. Again, check out the videos that I'll make specifically about the revolution if you want some more context there. Next thing I want to talk about is this children's history book that Winston picks up. And so right away, we know that history and the mutability of the past is a big issue in 1984. So when it's called a history book, we can guess that, maybe there's some propaganda happening here. So try and judge for yourself, where's the propaganda, where's the satire, and what might actually be true. So the history book, it seems like it's railing against the failure of capitalism in London during the revolution. And this is where we're going to take a look at William Blake's poem London and do a close reading of that. We'll make comparisons between William Blake's London poem to today, to the Industrial Revolution as it occurred in many Western countries, to contemporary London, to the czarist regime, and to the communist revolution. And so I will have a video specifically about this close reading posted. We'll do that all together so that we can close read as a class, and then I'll post that up. One of my questions for you all is, how is this section accurate regarding capitalism, and how is it a caricature? So as you're close reading the section from the children's history book, I want to know your opinions. Where is the children's history book critique of capitalism correct? Where is the critique of capitalism a caricature? And a caricature, again, is to make something, it's like a straw man. It's to give the weakest possible representation of that argument. It's to dumb something down, to lose nuance in the argument. So where is it true and where is it a caricature? And I want to know what you all think about that section. Next, moving on, there's this phrase that's used, jus prima noctis, is used to talk about how a capitalist could take basically any woman from the factory. And I'm going to fact check this, but from my memory, prima noctis was actually a term that was reserved for the kings, right? The kings in sort of an older world, maybe a more medieval society. The idea was that a king could choose, a king could choose to take a wife on her wedding day to his bed. And so there's this conflation here between capitalism in the history book and a kingdom. And that's supposed to be a little bit satirical or funny, the idea that there is a little bit of caricaturing going on here of capitalism. But again, I want you all to answer the question for me. How is the section accurate regarding capitalism, and how is it a caricature? Now let's look at page 74. There's this idea of reality versus ideal societies, of utopian societies versus reality. So Winston recalls back to that time when he actually held evidence in his hand that showed that Big Brother and the party were tampering with history, but he had to get rid of it. He made the choice to get rid of it, and that was in 1973. The story begins in the middle 60s with the revolution, the story of the counter-revolutionaries. And so again, this is an allegory of the Russian Revolution with the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, Trotsky. Stalin is clearly the Big Brother figure here. He's sort of, the counter-revolutionary who expunges all others, who has all of his competition murdered until he is the only one left standing. And so if you are interested in doing any sort of historical research, I'll have those direct allegories spelled out in my Russian Revolution video. The idea of, if this is an allegory similar to Animal Farm, where Napoleon was seen as Big Brother and Snowball was maybe more of a Trotsky figure, Here, we want to do the same kind of allegorical analysis, which is you have characters from 1984 and you have characters from the actual history of the Russian Revolution. And we try and draw parallels to see, okay, if Stalin is Big Brother, then who is Goldstein, right? Who are all these other figures that are named in this allegory? Now, it's also possible that some of this stuff is completely unique out of Orwell's mind. It doesn't necessarily all have to be a one-to-one allegorical relationship. He's also entitled to make things up, so we have to be careful for that too. We're almost done here with chapter 7, guys. So Winston is fascinated by this Rutherford character, who's possibly an allegorical figure as well. So we'll talk about that in the other video. At the very least, there's some symbolism occurring here, or to be more accurate, there is a simile, which is that Rutherford was like a mountain crumbling. And so just to give you an example of how similes work, you take a character or an idea, a person like Rutherford, and you make a comparison to something else using the word like or as. So if Rutherford is like a mountain crumbling, then we try to figure out what are the characteristics of a mountain crumbling that we can then attribute to Rutherford. And so the idea is that it was something great, it was something natural, profound, it was something epic, but it's being stripped down and it's degraded and its day is done. Maybe something that you never thought could crumble, something so epic and so grand that you're surprised to see it crumbling down. And that's kind of how we can look at Rutherford. Now, there's another little metaphoric idea here of under the spreading chestnut tree. There's a song that occurs. And I believe that this is metaphoric for, the kind of insidious or poisonous nature of the party where you're selling out your neighbor, you're selling out your brothers, but in the end, we're all invariably dying underneath the wrath of Big Brother. Rutherford and his companions have these broken noses, which is a sign of probably a forced confession, some sort of show trial or torture, and then he was executed. And so if you're at all interested in the actual true torture practices or the show trials that occurred in the Soviet Union, which Orwell is comparing to here, I'm going to have my own videos series about the Gulag Archipelago, about torture in Article 58. Winston's looking at a copy of the Times that verifies that the 3 confessions were lies and likely forced. And that is the piece of information that he had that proved that Big Brother was lying. It showed that Rutherford was out of the country when the crimes that he committed supposedly occurred. But because he's so scared, and back at that time in the 70s, he didn't have this counter-revolutionary mindset quite instilled in him. And so he throws that scrap of the Times into the memory hole, which, remember, is just a fire, and he burns it. And so he gives up that piece of hard proof, the only piece of hard proof he ever had to disprove Big Brother. He wondered if evidence was even really that powerful. Like, even if I had evidence showing that there was a lie, would it even convince anybody? Right. And so that makes me think of today's society, where we're getting into this world of, deep fakes, and this idea that, you could edit audio and you could basically make anybody look like they have done and said anything. And it's just curious how I think we may also be getting to that point in our society where is evidence going to lose its power because the nature of evidence is going to become questionable? And that's a question for you all to comment on. Nearing the end, Winston says, inevitably, the party would say that 2 + 2 = 5, and you would have to believe it. The existence of an external reality was denied by their philosophy. And so this is something that we will discuss in our seminars, which is the idea of, is there an external reality? Is there an objective reality? And how much of reality is subjective? This is a giant philosophical debate that continues to this day. There's evidence for both sides. And it's just a fun argument for you all to engage in if you haven't already, at least to understand what is the context for each side and what facts and evidence can support each side there. The idea is that when there's no external reality, there are no counterfactuals, there's no falsifiability, it's anti-logic, it's anti-science. 2 more quotes to end the chapter. page 80 at the bottom. If both the past and the external world exist only in the mind, and if the mind itself is controllable, what then? And page 81, the last paragraph, and quote, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." His heart sank as he thought of the enormous power arrayed against him, the ease with which any party intellectual would overthrow him in debate, the subtle arguments which he would not be able to understand, much less answer. And yet he was in the right. They were wrong and he was right. The obvious, the silly, and the true had got to be defended. Truisms are true. Hold on to that. The solid world exists. Its laws do not change. Stones are hard, water is wet. Objects unsupported fall towards the earth's center. With the feeling that he was speaking to O'Brien, and also that he was setting forth an important axiom, he wrote, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows." So I'd like y'all to do a little bit of a close reading or analysis on those two quotes and bring your ideas into our discussion of subjectivity versus objectivity. All right, I'll see you in chapter 8.